Latinos have been the largest minority group in the United States since 2003, currently making up an incredible 19% of the total U.S. population. That's 62.6 million people with Hispanic heritage living in the U.S. as of 2021. But the path that led us there is as complex and varied as the tapestry of the Latino experience itself. So, how did we get here, and what does it mean? We're taught that the beginning of America looks something like this. But Latinos have been in the US since before it was the US. That starts way back with indigenous people, when native societies existed in what is now present-day Mexico and the United States, each with their own cultures, languages, and traditions. Starting in the early 1500s, Spanish settlers and colonizers arrived in the Caribbean and Central and South America. And while this colonization led to the melding of cultures that would become the Spanish-speaking Latinos we know today, it was built on the foundation of bloodshed, disease, and near extinction of indigenous life and culture.
My Indian ancestors, Aztecs, Mayans, Toltecs, and their tribes and nations suffered, but they survived.
Spain gained territories throughout modern-day Mexico and the US, establishing some of the earliest American cities, like St. Augustine and Santa Fe. By the time the early 1800s came around, Anglo-Americans started taking over those parts of what is now the US. First came individual groups of settlers in places like Texas and Florida.
These were hard-bitten frontiersmen, looking, as Americans always were, for better land to farm and fresh opportunities.
Then it became the center of government philosophy. Manifest destiny, or the idea that it was America's God-given destiny to expand throughout North America, fueled further Anglo expansion and annexation in the mid-1800s of what were now Mexican territories, gobbling up the southwestern and western states one by one through war, treaties, and force. Suddenly, these people who were once Mexican were now American. Today, many Mexican Americans can trace their roots to these early US Latinos in places like Texas, California, Arizona, and New Mexico. It's all nicely summed up by a saying Mexican Americans use to this day.
My family never crossed a border, the border crossed us.
By the late 1800s, the US had officially gained control of the remaining Spanish territories: Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. At the same time, US businesses and governments started inserting themselves into several Caribbean and Latin American countries, wielding massive economic and political influence. This included significantly overhauling existing laws and inserting American business interests like sugar plantations and the Panama Canal into these countries. But it all frequently came at the expense of the people living there. After the US helped create these unstable and often dangerous political environments in many Latin American countries, the first major waves of Latino immigrants started trickling into the US in the early 1900s. But Hispanics also moved to the US for another significant reason. American companies recruited them for cheap labor. Railroad lines, automotive factories, fruit farms, cotton fields, meatpacking plants, steel factories, mines. There's virtually no part of late 19th and early 20th century US society that Latinos aren't partly responsible for. They're also responsible for a rich history of organized labor movements that started during this time. Over decades, their painstaking efforts resulted in higher wages, better working conditions, and even paths to legal migration.
A member of the union has the right to be represented in the farm by a contract by collective bargaining. And then on those things that have nothing to do with collective bargaining, but affect him as a human being, the union's responsibility is to go in there and help him do that too, you know.
While an exact total number of Latino migration is unknown, we do know that more than 1 million Mexicans migrated to the Southwest between 1900 and 1930 alone. After World War II, even more migrants made their way to the US. Starting with Puerto Ricans escaping economic crises in the 1950s, Cubans fleeing Fidel Castro's regime, and Colombians leaving civil war, violence, and a lack of job opportunities in the 1960s, and the civil wars and social turmoil that caused Central Americans to come in the 1980s. And like European immigrants, Latinos settled in all different places for different reasons and had different experiences. Yet, unlike European immigrants, most were bound together by the bond of one language. Many suffered racism, violence, and unfair living conditions. Not to mention the growing fear from white Americans that the America they knew was changing into something to fear. Which brings us to today, where Latinos make up the largest ethnic group after white Americans. Here's how the U.S. Latino diaspora looks broken down by country of origin, whether they were born or can trace their roots there. Mexico takes the top spot with nearly 60% of the U.S. Latino population, followed by Puerto Rico, El Salvador, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. But as you can see, the list of countries where Latino families come from is long and varied, and the diversity doesn't stop there. Latinos come in every color of the rainbow, live in all different parts of the US, range from speaking fluent Spanish to none at all, have varying degrees of connection to their country of origin, and face different immigration statuses. All these factors and more contribute to what makes up the Latino population in the US today. And it's not just in population numbers that Latinos have contributed to this country. They've also played a huge role in shaping the US in ways that are both visible and invisible. Visible in how we remember Latino heroes like Cesar Chavez, Roberto Clemente, Dolores Huerta, Gabriela Mistral, Selena, Rita Moreno, and Gwen Ifill, just to name a few. Invisible when you factor in the countless farm laborers, factory workers, vaqueros, small business owners, teachers, health aides, entrepreneurs, construction workers, and more who have worked behind the scenes to make America what it is today. The good news is, never before have Latinos had more visibility and representation in business and politics in the US than they do right now. For the first time, they make up more than 10% of the House of Representatives. And according to the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, a record 21 Latinos now hold statewide office. But we're still a long way off, because despite great strides in representation, compared to the size of their population, Latinos are still grossly underrepresented in many of those same major sectors. Latinos also continue to face regular prejudice. Anti-immigrant sentiment in the US has steadily increased in the last decade, and 39% of Latinos are constantly worried that they or a loved one will be deported. But there's still a lot of room for optimism. The number of Hispanic Americans who are eligible to vote has increased by 4.7 million since 2018. That's 62% of the total growth in US voters. And today, while Latinos make up a record 14% of voters in the US, this electorate will only continue to grow and become more powerful in the years to come, which should continue to motivate politicians to listen to the needs of this varied group.